What's going on, everybody? It's Joe, and welcome back to another episode of Sleeper Sunday. Sleeper Sunday, for those of you that don't know, is a series I came up with showcasing fun hidden decks you may not know about that can do quite a bit of damage in the proper hands. We'll be going over a basic deck list, strengths, weaknesses, what can be done to make the deck better, and of course a few replays to see the deck in action. In today's episode, we're going to be going over the winner of this month's poll being Windwitch. Windwitch is an archetype of wind spellcaster monsters that debuted in Raging Tempest back in 2017, and their only other support was out of Blazing Vortex in February of 2021. I love that set, it gave us kits. They consist of female witches, as you can probably tell by the name, Windwitch, hence the wind spellcaster theming, with a bit of a burn gimmick going on, as well as a bunch of field swarming in order to go into their synchro-focused extra deck. And while it's not necessary about like the actual lore of the cards or anything like that, did you know that this was like the best invoked engine for a while? Oh, and I totally forgot to mention they were used by Rin in the Arc 5 anime, so there's that too. Moving on to the actual cards themselves though, first we have basically the most iconic one, or the iconic trio I should say, with these first three with their first wave, starting with Windwitch Icebell. Windwitch Icebell is a level 3 wind spellcaster. I'm not going to mention that they're wind spellcasters anymore, by the way, because of course. With 1000 attack and defense that says if you control no monsters, you can special summon this card from your hand, then you can special summon a Windwitch monster from your deck, but it cannot be tributed. Keep in mind this happens at the same time, so if it gets ashed, it does stay in your hand, but it can't get impermed on the summon from deck, for example. It also says you cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck for the turn you activate this effect, except level 5 or higher wins. If it's normal or special summon though, you can inflict 500 damage to your opponent. You can only use each effect of Icebell once per turn. So if you couldn't tell, Icebell is basically the main starter of the deck. It is your bread and butter. You always want to open an Icebell in your hand in order to get your plays going. She's the most basic one card combo and basically the most iconic card in the deck. Being able to summon herself and another body directly from the deck at once is really big, but the bigger thing is that on summon she gets that burn, which doesn't seem like much because I mean it is only 500 burn admittedly, and they only have one thing that actually triggers when something gets burned, and this typically isn't triggering while that's on field. But the big thing is that it chain blocks your things that work on summon. For example, Windwitch Glassbell, a level 4 that says on summon you can add a Windwitch from your deck to your hand, but it locks you into winds for the rest of the turn. So basically, Icebell is going to be summoning Glassbell directly from the deck, and then you can go chain 1 Glassbell, chain 2 Icebell in order to chain block from certain negates. Granted, if they had an Ash, they'd probably hit the Icebell anyway, but if they had something else that would trigger immediately on summon of the Glassbell or activation of its effect, then you can at least block it with that 500 burn. Here you'll notice a different common theme about the deck though is that they have a pretty harsh Xeno lock, with Icebell's restriction actually being the only reason why you don't really play the Windwitch engine in Speedroid anymore, because it locks you out of your Cork Shooter and your Rubber Band Shooter. I think I mentioned this in the Speedroid Sleeper Sunday, which is funny, I actually had both, and I had Icebell featured as a card in one of the secondary options you can play, because while it's not the worst engine you could play, it does conflict with your things like Terror Top, which we will get into, and again, locking you out of your Link monster especially is huge, and also having Cork Shooter being blocked off is also pretty bad. It's also one of the biggest reasons why, we'll talk about it in like the weaknesses and stuff, but why this deck struggles in a lot of aspects, because locking you into wins when there's only so many decent win targets is pretty rough. The final monster of the original trio is Windwitch Snowbell, is a level 1 tuner with 100 attack and defense that says if you control 2 or more winds and no non-winds, you can special summon this card from your hand, and a wind synchro that was summoned using this card as material cannot be destroyed by your opponent's card effects. So basically the standard combo goes Icebell, summon Glassbell, Glassbell adds Snowbell, special Snowbell, and then you start climbing into your synchros, and by that I mean all 2 of them. And this typically does get you access to a Crystal Wing, which is like your big endboard piece that cannot be destroyed by card effects, and it's also on summon number 5, so your opponent can't nib you. Again though, we do see more of that really harsh Xeno lock. Saying if you control 2 or more wind monsters isn't a big idea in itself, but the fact that you have to control no non-winds makes it really hard to come back from something like a Nibiru or a Lava Golem or something, for example, or even something as simple as a Book of Moon, because keep in mind, a face-down monster is considered a non-wind monster, which I learned the hard way in the Trap Tricks matchup after getting hit with a Floodgate Trap Hole, and it was pretty rough because my Glassbell got booked, and then I couldn't use Snowbell to summon. In a similar vein, we also have Windwitch Freeze Bell. She was part of the second wave of support. She's at level 3 that says if all monsters you control are Windwitch minimum 1, you can special summon this card from your hand. Again, another pretty harsh Xenolock saying you have to only control Windwitches. And this is a hard once per turn, by the way. And once per turn during your main phase, you can increase its level by 1, and a Wind Synchro that was summoned using this card as material cannot be destroyed by battle. Freeze Bell is another really decent card if you are only having like the Windwitches and stuff on board, because of course you do get to get that free body on board that can be level 3 or 4, which is really flexible, and it's really good as a non-tuner because the deck has 3 tuners and only 2 non-tuners, which is pretty rough unless you open Speedroid cards to go along with it. But the protection is also pretty solid. A lot of the time, if you open a decent enough hand, you can go for the Indestructible Crystal Wing by card effects, and then something like an Indestructible Virtual World Juju protected from battle off the Freeze Bell. The other main deck monster they got from their second wave of support is Windwitch Blizzard Bell. It's a level 5 tuner, and it says during your opponent's main phase, if you control a Windwitch other than Blizzard Bell, quick effect, you can send this card from your hand or field to the graveyard to inflict 500 damage to your opponent, and you can only use this effect of Blizzard Bell once per turn. So, I'm not gonna lie here, this card kinda sucks. You play it for a few different reasons. 1, because it's a level 5 tuner and you can summon it from deck off of your spell card. 2, because it has that burn effect, which does technically trigger their in-archetype boss monster in the very rare instances you do end on it, which I'm pretty sure is the point of this card. And that's really the only reason I can think of. The fact that it only lets you normal summon it without tributing is kind of awful, and I have no idea why you couldn't just let it special summon itself. Also, being a tuner is really annoying because you'd rather have that level for a non-tuner, so you can use your low-level tuners to go into your level 6 or 8 synchro plays. But now you're in a really bad spot because the only way you're going to be able to do that is with something like a Freeze Bell, and so you can kind of see where I'm going here. This card was being played at 2 at the list that I referenced, and then I ended up dropping it down to 1 because I just wasn't ending on the boss monster enough and opening this at the same time consistently enough for it to really be warranted. Speaking of Speedroid engine though, we are playing a small one. We have 1 Terratop and 3 Takatomborg and 1 Red-Eyed Dice. You've probably never seen 1 Terratop, 3 Takatomborg outside of pure Speedroid before, and that's very simple. It's literally just because Ice Bell and Terratop conflict with each other directly, as opposed to Takatomborg not really specifying Speedroids or anything. So even without the Terratop, the Takatomborg is a pretty good level 3 extender. So basically, if you open like Terratop, you go Terratop, add Takatomborg, special Takatomborg, and then the Takatomborg can special the Red-Eyed Dice from the deck, because locking you into wins isn't a big deal in this deck, of course. And then the Red-Eyed Dice can manipulate the Terratop's level into whatever level you want in order to go into a certain synchro play, such as a Clear Wing or something like that. It's pretty simple but pretty effective, though it really does get annoying when you're going into Speedroid plays and then you have like Freeze Bell or Blizzard Bell in hand and you can't really do anything with them because they specify Windwitches. And that's it for the actual like monster engine in the deck, really. It's pretty compact because again, there's really only 2 waves of support for Windwitch. I really thought there were at least 1 more. But we did decide to put a lot of non-engine in the deck. 3 Lava Golem being a big one because you are playing 3 Ice Bell and 1 Terratop, so you technically don't really need to commit to your normal summon a lot. To be fair, you could replace this with something like a Nibiru, but then the problem becomes that you have a Nib on board that you can't do anything with because it's not a wind, and then it stops all of your other things. So you could also just replace this with a different hand trap like Effect Veiler. So it's really up to you, because the Lava Golem has come up in a few situations where I didn't open the Ice Bell or the Terratop, and so I'm sitting there with like a Glass Bell in my hand that can't really do anything. For the rest of the hand traps, we have 3 Ash and 3 Imperm because it's 3 Ash, 3 Imperm, and then 3 Ghost Mourner because it is not only a solid hand trap, but it's also a level 3 wind tuner that you can normal summon in a pinch to make a lot of your synchro plays. Their only archetypal spell is Windwitch Chimes. It's a normal spell that says target a Windwitch you control and special one with a different name from your deck in defense position. It's a hard once per turn and you're locked into wins. It's a pretty simple but pretty strong card overall. It's really good in case you get hand trapped on something like Glass Bell, for example, or I mean if you get hand trapped on the Ice Bell, you can like normal the Ice Bell after you get it ashed, and then use the Chimes to summon the Glass Bell anyway, and then go for your full combo. Sucks that it's a hard once per turn, but it's not really the end of the world. It is a really nice extender to open. We're also playing 2 talents and 1 thrust because, I mean, it's talents and thrust, and a lot of the time in this deck, going second isn't a big deal because you can use like things like the lava golem and your decent amount of hand traps, and so these will also aid in that regard. We're also playing 1 Monster Reborn because it's a really clunky synchro focused deck, so having that extra extension is pretty cool. And then we're playing the 1 Called By because Called By. And then the final card is their in-archetype trap, 3 copies of Icy Breeze Refrain, which I will admit now you can probably cut down to lower copies, though the problem does come from it being unsearchable. But it says activate one of the following effects. Either special summon a Windwitch from your graveyard in defense position, or when your opponent activates a card or effect in response to your Windwitch monster's effect, negate that opponent's effect. So this card's pretty decent for the grind game, summoning back your Windwitches and kind of stalling out your opponent, burning them a little bit, getting some extra bodies on board, you know, kind of preventing them from like completely killing you, or summoning back one of your bigger synchros later on. Also, in my weaker format that I actually built this deck for, in the first place that made me want to actually try it out, this card is really strong because if your opponent tries to hand trap you in the late game with one of the one-of hand traps, you can just easily negate it with the Icy Breeze Refrain. To be fair, again, because we are playing Thrust anyway, you might be able to cut this to 2 or even 1 copies and just fit some more non-engine in, but I was mainly just experimenting with the 3 copies because it is unsearchable as a card. And that's it for the main deck. Moving on to the extra deck, both of their synchro monsters, interestingly enough, are out of Blazing Vortex. They didn't have their own synchro for the longest time because they were like anime focused on the Clearwing stuff to my knowledge. But starting off, we have the big Windwitch Diamond Bell. This is their level 8 synchro that requires a tuner and 1 or more non-tuner wins. On Synchro Summon, you can target a Windwitch in your graveyard and inflict damage to your opponent equal to half its attack, and that is a hard once per turn. Also, soft once per turn, if your opponent takes battle or effect damage, you can target a card in the field and destroy it, but if it was Synchro Summon using only Windwitches, you can use this effect up to twice per turn. So Diamond Bell is of course what you're supposed to use with the Blizzard Bell, technically. They want you to like have the Blizzard Bell in hand, discard it, burn for 500, and then pop a card off the Diamond Bell, which isn't like the best thing in the world. This card becomes a lot better when you're going second or on turn 3, just whenever you're trying to break apart the board, because you can easily get up to 2 pops per turn, guaranteed 1 off of its first effect, and you're going to be burning for some pretty good damage if you take into account the Windwitch Winter Bell that's probably going into it. It's a level 7 synchro that requires a tuner, 1 or more non-tuner wins. This says you can target a Windwitch in your grave and burn your opponent equal to its level times 200. Also, during the battle phase, this doesn't come up much, by the way. Quick effect, you can target 1 Windwitch you control, and special a monster from your hand with a level less than or equal to that monster's, but it cannot attack this turn. So typically your line goes Ice Bell into Glass Bell into Snow Bell, and then you use Ice Bell and Glass Bell for Winter Bell burns for Glass Bell's level, and then you go Glass Bell and Snow Bell into Crystal Wing, or if you're going second, you're going to go into Diamond Bell. I know there was a lot of bells in that sentence, and it probably sounds like a Christmas carol in here, but there's just a lot of bells in this archetype. It's all pretty simplistic, and I do really wish that Winter Bell especially did something more, especially for its second effect, because its second effect just really doesn't come up aside from slower formats, but it is fine for chipping for a little bit more damage, or even sometimes baiting disruption. As I mentioned, we are of course playing 1 Crystal Wing because this is basically your boss monster. Take the best Speedroid end board and then cut it by like 1/10, and that's your end board with Windwitch. We're also playing Clearwing Synchro and Fast Dragon here, both of which have their own actual applications. I did make Clearwing a few more times than I thought I would when I was experimenting with this deck. Unfortunately, I read it wrong, and I thought it protected from nib. I don't think I actually did get nibbed when I had it on board, but I was so mad when I realized after I put it on board, it only stops effects on field, not effects in hand, so it's not nib protection at all. But Clearwing Fast Dragon can sometimes be better depending on the matchup, because it can basically imperm and then change to 0 a monster special summon from the extra deck, which is pretty cool. Also, I highly doubt it'll ever come up, but you could technically use its Pendulum ability. Like if you went Red-Eyed Dice, change Terror Top to level 6, and then you can send both to special the Fast Dragon from your Pendulum Zone. I think that'd be pretty funny if that did come up. And then we're also playing 1 Stardust Charge Warrior, because, I mean, it's Stardust Charge Warrior, it's a level 6 Wind Synchro, it's pretty solid. So we're playing 1 Muddy Mud Dragon as well. There's kind of like a thing that I kind of decided to throw in, because to be fair, you're going to be locked into wins more often than not, right? So you're not really making this often, if ever. I actually never made it yet. But it's mainly to go into your 1 in archetype fusion monster. Yes, They have an in-archetype fusion monster because of lore, Windwitch Crystal Bell. It requires Winter Bell, which is the point of the Mud Dragon, and one Windwitch monster. It says you can target a monster in either player's graveyard, and until the end phase, this card's name becomes that target's original name, and copy its effects. If this card in your possession is destroyed by your opponent's card by battle or card effect, and sent to your graveyard, you can target a Winter Bell and a level 4 or lower Windwitch in your grave and special summon them. This never comes up. I'm telling you right now, I have not made the Mud Dragon, so I have not made this. The only time otherwise that this would come up is if you are playing the Super Poly, which I'll just talk about now. Super Poly is a very good side deck option for this deck, especially when you're trying to break apart boards, though it does prevent you from using things like your Ice Spell, of course. It can at least end up being pretty decent. You can go into Mud Dragon and then declare Wind, and so you can make it a Wind and at least have some plays going. And then there's also the World Chalice Guard Dragon Marduk. It's a pretty good target against a lot of Link spammy decks. It's a big 3k body, big Wind, so it's also pretty cool. But yeah, other than that, really, the Mud Dragon doesn't come up, and I'll probably end up cutting it in the future, though it is just something kind of cute you can play. We're also playing High Speedroid Chanbara as a level 5 target, and I don't know why, so this should probably be ahead of this. But we're playing Chanbara and Kendama. Kendama's actually pretty good in case you get hit with a disruption. For example, I went into this at one point to play around Runic Flashing Fire, because that's what I expected. I thought they were going to Flashing Fire pop the Kendama, and then I can special summon it back from my graveyard because I didn't normal summon that turn. Also, the burn does technically come up for the archetype. And then we are playing Chanbara as a really good level 5 target, because sometimes you can actually make a level 5, which is really, really good. I actually really like Chanbara as a card, getting the double swing and making itself bigger, and also being able to technically add back banished Speedroid cards could come up due to Kendama, but it probably isn't going to. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we are playing the one Virtual World Juju. Really, really good card. This card comes up actually a lot more than I thought it would, because I've never seen this card really made often. But it can't be destroyed by battle or card effects while you have 2 or more monsters in your graveyard with the same original type and attribute, all Wind spellcasters or Wind machines, and so that's going to almost always be protected. But also you can banish 2 monsters from your graveyard with the same original type and attribute but different names, and then target a card in the field and send it to the graveyard. Really solid removal, a decent sized body, and it has some really good protection. Arguably one of the strongest cards in the extra deck, which says a lot. And finally, this doesn't come up all the time, but I did have an extra spot, and I figured I might as well have some, like, a little bit of extra removal, so I did decide to play a copy of Typhon. Typhon's just such a good card, really, no matter what deck you're playing, and so there's no real explanation needed there. Moving on to the alternatives, again, as I mentioned, there is the Super Poly package, but alongside that, especially with the Crystal Bell in particular, we have 1 Instant Fusion and 1 Independent Nightingale. The idea is, of course, to go Independent Nightingale, burn for 500, and then use the Crystal Bell in order to copy it, and then burn for like 4,000 or 4,000, 45, something like that. I think it's 4,000. Big damage there, plus the other burn damage you can do with the rest of your Windwitch stuff. Maybe you could even push for game there, but it's really not consistent enough to warrant, in my opinion. Also, SP Little Knight is SP Little Knight, but it's almost never going to come up because you're locked into wins all the time. Burning Soul is a card that I saw in the list that I referenced, and I thought it was pretty cool, but it's mostly just better in the alternate formats in which this deck is played, like the Dogwater format list I just showed you. It just does a lot more there. As I mentioned, this was one of the best invoked variants for the longest time. I think until Mech Knight actually came out, this was the best variant, which is pretty funny. And then, again, as I mentioned, you have the Speedroid stuff. You can play like a heavier Speedroid engine. You could technically go into this if you don't use Ice Spell. It just really, really sucks that Ice Spell locks you out of the Rubber Band Shooter, because I would argue that if that wasn't the case, you could easily play a really heavy hybrid Speedroid Windwitch deck again, like you did back before Links were a thing. But that is going to do it for the deck list. I will try to leave the list that I referenced down in the link in the description, even though I did change up a lot from that list because it definitely seemed like a bit more of a casual sort of list. I tried to make this as competitively viable as possible, though it was pretty difficult. But with that being said, let's go ahead and get right onto some replays. Alright, and that is it for the replays I gathered for this deck. If you couldn't tell, a lot of people were playing Stun on the EDO Pro last night. That Runic player was actually the same person twice that I ended up playing against. I played against him once, and then I ended up scooping because I got like completely demolished from like a DD Dynamite play, and then like my entire deck got thinned out. And then later on in the same session, I eventually ended up running into them again. I completely forgot that they went by the name Player in lowercase, but so does everybody else apparently. But then I ended up getting my vengeance at least. And I know that last stun match was just probably really boring to sit through. It was really boring to play through for me, don't worry. It was just the only kind of stuff I could really get. I only had a handful of games, and these were probably some of my worst Sleeper Sunday replays I've ever gotten, but let's go ahead and start talking more about the deck's strengths and weaknesses. So starting off with the strengths, let's be a little bit lighthearted. It is a fairly consistent deck. I mean, you have Ice Bell and Terror Top, both as some pretty strong starters, especially Ice Bell, and it's a very linear deck in what it can do. The Ice Bell line is super simple, super easy to perform, and it has a few different ways to extend, such as Windwitch Chimes, in case you do end up getting hit with a hand trap. The simplicity of the engine also allows you to play a lot of non-engine. Again, you can cut even more copies of Icy Breeze Refrain to play even more non-engine. Also, Lava Golem can be substituted for other hand traps. So in theory, you could have like 3, 6, 9, 12, 14 different hand traps, plus your talents and your thrust and your called buys and stuff like that. You could even cut Monster Reborn to have a 15th engine slot or non-engine slot. It's like a lot of space that you can use for certain things. But if I'm gonna be honest, that's probably where the strengths kind of just stop for me. I mean, maybe other than talking about the protection being nice on the things that they make. But when I was playing this deck in my alternate format, right, I overhyped it a lot because it's probably one of the stronger decks in that format because it can actually do something, right? It ends on the Crystal Wing, and that's about it. So keep in mind, this format, by the way, you can only play one archetype, and you can only play one copy of any generic card that isn't part of your archetype, such as hand traps. And compared to a lot of the other decks in this format that are on the list that you can play, it's actually pretty decent. So that's what made me want to decide to put it on the poll. However, it ended up not really performing to my expectations when I brought it into the actual, like, competitive format. Because when we move on to the weaknesses, holy fuck are these Xeno locks annoying. Locked into 5 or higher wins, locked into wins period. These two require you to only play Windwitches or have Windwitches, so it just significantly limits what you can do. And even then, cards like Blizzard Bell, the audacity to require only Windwitches just for you to be able to normal summon it without tributing. In fact, it's just Gen X Furnace. It's just slightly better Gen X Furnace, which Retta already made an entire rant about in the Gen X video when he made Legacy of the Worthless. It's like just the audacity to require like something so specific just for a normal summon without tribute is infuriating. And one of the problems that comes with that is the Windwitch like extra deck monsters themselves aren't really that great either. I mean, Winterbell serves as a teeny little bit of burn. I mean, you get maximum like 1400 if you have another Winterbell already engraved. No, 1600 if you have a Diamond Bell already engraved. But most of the time you're getting 800 off of a Glass Bell. And then Diamond Bell, it just doesn't do enough. I mean, it's fine for breaking boards, being able to pop twice and deal some pretty decent burn. Not the end of the world, and it's a pretty beefy body, but it's just not enough, especially going first. This means that basically you have to use any of the other level 5 or higher wind pool, which isn't super great. I mean, Crystal Wing Pass is so bad, y'all. It's so bad. Not to mention Clear Wing is too specific. Fast Dragon's a little too late to really do anything in the turn. Charge Warrior doesn't really do anything, it's just there for draw power. And then these, they're doing their best, you know? Same with Juju, right? You're basically just playing significantly nerfed Speedroid, and I thought Speedroid was super fun. That was one of my favorite Sleeper Sundays to make, because the combo lines were super non-linear for the most part. You could just do so much, you had so much extension going for you, you had a bunch of things in the extra deck you could make, whereas when it comes to Windwitch, you're kind of just praying you don't get hand trapped too much, because even your certain extenders like Takatomborg lock you out of your other extenders like Freeze Bell. It's just really annoying. So your locks are too harsh, your extenders are too specific, especially Freeze Bell and Blizzard Bell. I wouldn't even count Blizzard Bell as an extender. and the cards that you do have are just really weak for how harsh the restrictions are. So with that being said, how are we making Windwitch better? Well, it's actually going to be a little bit of an effort. You'd probably need a whole new like 4 or 5 card wave of support to actually make them relevant, but I think it can be done. For instance, I want another good target to summon off of Ice Spell, or at least something that can be good on normal summon to go alongside it. Ice Spell's ability to chain block is really strong, so to have another target if you already open Glass Spell, or if Glass Spell isn't like kind of the move for that turn, would be really cool. Something that has a really strong on summon effect. Maybe it summons a Windwitch from hand or graveyard. That would be pretty cool. Another thing I wanted to talk about is that they don't really have any other 1-card starters. Terror Top kind of does its own thing. It really just passes on like the Clear Wing most of the time. And Ice Spell is like your only really big 1-card starter, so I'd like to see another either way to access Ice Spell, like a Rhoda, which would be really good, like on a spell card, or another thing that works on summon or in hand, or maybe even in graveyard that summons another thing from graveyard. Just kind of something else that can give you either good comeback ability later on so you don't have to rely on Ice Spell, because relying on Ice Spell when you have like a Nib token on your board or something sucks. Or just something to have alongside Ice Spell as a secondary 1-card starter, which would be really good in case the Ice Spell does get ashed in your hand. I would also love to see another extender without such harsh restrictions. Maybe just if you control a wind monster, special summon this Windwitch from your hand, and then have it be a non-tuner specifically, like preferably, maybe even a low-level one to kind of do some low-level synchro plays with Glass Spell, because they have too many tuners in my opinion. A big problem I noticed with a lot of the synchro decks we play on this series, you have so many tuners on board and like not enough non-tuners in the slightest. That was a big problem with Speedroid, was that I was sitting there with a bunch of really strong tuners and then like one non-tuner, and it was just, I don't know. So a simple non-tuner extender that you could easily slap into the archetype would be really cool. I also want to see them get one more good extra deck card, like an actual boss monster that does something on your opponent's turn reliably. I mean, it could literally be something as simple as burn your opponent on activation of something. Hell, you could even make it something really simple, like every time your opponent activates a monster effect, burn him for 200. Something super simple like that. That way, in case your opponent tries to chain to it, you could use your Icy Breeze Refrain more consistently. And speaking of, it would be cool if it also searched Icy Breeze Refrain on summon, or if they had some other way to search Icy Breeze Refrain, because this card could be pretty solid if they had something that worked more properly on the opponent's turn, because you could have a really good negate on top of an end board. A big problem with the deck, going back onto like the extender section, you can tell this isn't scripted compared to my usual ones, right? I completely forgot to make a script for this. I'm kind of just freeballing it. But another topic on the, another thing on the topic of extenders, I should say, is that the deck kind of struggles to make more than one synchro per turn, with a really good hand consisting of like Ice Spell plus Glass Spell plus Tack-a-Tom board plus Freeze Bell, stuff like that. Then you can make like 2 synchros per turn, sometimes Crystal Wing Diamond Bell or Crystal Wing Juju. So I'd like to just see them have more ways to make additional synchros and be more of a synchro spam deck, unless they got like a super big towers or protect the castle kind of thing, but Underworld Goddess would kind of just trump that anyway. I think the deck has a really solid base going for it. I mean, Ice Spell is just such a strong card, even with such a harsh restriction, but it's just a little too linear, and it doesn't do enough compared to other synchro decks, because it's not like you're ending on a towers to compensate for your lack of synchro spamming, so you're kind of just playing a bad synchro deck. I think the archetype is neat. I really like the artwork. I really like all the effects coming together, especially just resolving Ice Spell feels really clean. And it also kind of takes me back to a bit more of a nostalgic time of Yu-Gi-Oh! Back in like 2017, which, I mean, saying nostalgic for that might seem weird to some of you, but that was 7 years ago. You are going to feel old and you're gonna like it. But with all that out of the way, I'm not sure how much more I can say about Windwitch. It was definitely one of my coat picks for Sleeper Sunday. I was super excited when it got picked, and then I realized, wow, this just kind of sucks. When I was getting replays, which I have the full unedited VOD of me getting the replays for this deck up on my channel, if you want to go check it out and you haven't already, I did stream it. I literally got not a single replay, because I won a single game, I believe, to my knowledge, or if I did win more, there was like almost instantly, like, because they didn't have anything and so it wasn't worth getting a replay. I won a single game and decided not to keep it because it was one of my content creator friends kind of just trolling and messing around to kind of like dip my toes in the water with this deck. And so it was really, really embarrassing, not gonna lie, because I really thought this deck was a lot stronger, but it's just something that's going to need a lot more extra support in order to actually be viable. But that's just my opinion. Let me know yours in the comments below, because that's gonna do it for the video. If you liked it, please sure to leave a like, as I'll split this video and the channel into the YouTube recommended. And if this kind of start my streamer like the rest of my Sleeper Sunday series, I will be trying to get back to my monthly Sleeper Sundays. It really sucked missing that last month because I was focusing more on Pokemon, and I really didn't want to miss this month now that I'm slowly starting to get back into Yu-Gi-Oh! Then perhaps consider subscribing and turning on notifications if you haven't already, because it supports the channel with everything else, and it's absolutely free, and we're trying to get to 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2024. Also, want to support me directly with getting some awesome TCG merch in this process, check out Tapioca's in the link down below, use code AURORA5 for 5% off your purchase at checkout, and support me financially. Once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Aurora, signing off.